Of course, I know it's been a while, but we're all reminded of the rules, right? Camera's got to be on for me to give you credit. You can't miss more than 15 hours. We take a break, da da da. Are we good with, do we need to go back over, refresh on that? Are we all good with class? Good. Okay, perfect. Perfect. I know sometimes when we take a day off. Um, another thing I have for you guys, while we were gone, they updated our exclusive buyer agency agreement. So we have a new form, which I have loaded in the online learning system for you. It's under our Julie folder. And I have the new and indicated that it is new as such. What does this mean for your test? You are always tested on the current material. And if you guys will, real quick, turn with me in your books to pages 243 and 244. 243 and 244. 244. Even though, and this thing took a drastic change, you guys, I'm still sorting through it. I'm still trying to decipher through it. But even though this thing had the major overhaul that it did, the testable provisions are still the same. So when we look at 243 to 244, we still talk about in our new buyer agency agreement, we still talk about the type of property. So right here, services provided. Firm will assist buyer in locating the property in the following, describe the type and the location. So we still have that. Other professional advice is still on here. Here's still our fees, how we're going to get paid, when we earn our fee versus when it's due and payable. Dual agency, still talk about dual agency. This might be something they revamp this a little bit. So you may want to read this to another source for dual agency, authorization to do dual agency or not. Here's our other professional advice. It's on page 243, specifically when working with buyers. This comes up a lot because buyers are looking at us on the regular. You know, I don't know a home inspector, who should I use? I don't know a lender, who should I use? So we're going to be recommending other professional advice. And then the last thing is the confidentiality. I'm not going to disclose the terms of an offer without the offeror's permission. So you may be in a situation where you're a listing agent in multiple offers, and you may get a call from a selling agent that says, what's the highest priced offer you have in your hand? License law says I can't answer that without the offeror's permission. Same thing when working with buyers. You may be working with two buyers that are interested in the same property. We have to keep that information confidential. We cannot disclose the terms of an offer without the offeror's permission. So really, I got to tell you guys, I'm still trying to process. Our previous buyer agency agreement was 7 pages, and now we're down to 3. So I'm still wondering what happened to 4 of those pages and why I've been talking about them with buyers for the last 10 plus years. I don't know. I'm, like I said, I'm still sorting through it. But what I do know for you guys is that what you can be tested on hasn't changed. So I have the current, the revised exclusive buyer agency agreement in here for you. Of course, we still have our listing agreement that did not change. But yeah, and this is all, there's going to be a lot of changes in the next year or so because of that NAR settlement as more and more of that unfolds. And I say that just to say, you guys be prepared coming into the industry. You're going to come into changes. So just be patient, that all get worked out. Questions or comments about our brand new exclusive buyer agency agreement? Let's see. I don't have my chat up. Good morning. Yeah, and you know, forms, I mean, forms update on the regular. I used to joke that the only thing consistent in real estate is change. So, hang on to your hats. It's just this NAR settlement thing has been a big, and y'all, this thing hasn't even settled yet. This is still the proposed stuff. So I fear once it settles, we're going to be looking at more. I can't tell you what, but what we do today may not be what we do tomorrow. So again, please hear me. You guys are coming into a changing industry. So I need you to, when you're shopping around for firms, I need you to have good leadership. I need you to have a strong BIC. I need you to be comfortable with somebody that you can make sure can get you these changes. And once this change is done, there's another change right behind it. That's the fun thing about real estate. Anything else on this? Again, it's in the Julie folder, so you guys have it. The other thing I want to do before we get back in, I kind of wanted to do a quick review on our financing. So let's put our lender hats back on for just a minute. Y'all get your phones, and let's start out with a Kahoot. So this Kahoot is from units 14 and 15, kind of get us warmed up. It's true and false only. There's your game pin. If you're doing the app or the website, if you're scanning the QR code, it'll just take you right in. Everybody in that wants to play? Yeah, if you don't want to play on your phone, that's fine. Just play in your mind. All right. Let's see what we got here. True, false, Kahoot on units 14 and 15, finance. Question number 1. The loan to value ratio is the amount of the borrower's down payment. True or false? Good job. The loan to value ratio is what the lender's bringing. Remember, anytime you see finance, I want you to put your lender hat on. And we're thinking about through the eyes of the lender. So when the borrower goes to the lender and says, give me money to buy a house, the lender's going to ask themselves, what is their loan to value ratio? And I know it's a little hard to see, but loan to value ratio. And what that answers, the question it answers for the lender is, how much of the value of the property do you want from me? How much of the loan amount do you want from me? Loan to value ratio is what the lender is bringing. 80%, 90%, whatever. Questions on this one? Let's see what we got out the gate here. So I got Cece, got it right the fastest, followed by Jen and Shay, Hill, and Bavia. Question number 2, true or false? Discount points or prepaid interest? Five seconds. Yep, that's all they are. Prepaid interest. If you're prepaying something, then you're paying it early. You're paying it ahead of time. So with discount points, the borrower is prepaying interest. They're paying some of their interest at settlement. The reason they may do that is one of two. Discount points are purchased either to decrease the borrower's interest rate or increase the lender's yield. Decrease interest rate. What do I get if I bring you money? I get a lower interest rate. What does the lender get? They get a higher yield. The yield is just their rate of return. Questions on this one? CC, Jen, Shay, and Hill are staying on. Liz on the board. Question number 3, true or false? With an adjustable rate mortgage, the interest rate is the same for the life of the loan. When we're talking financing in the real estate world, I can't speak for all loans, but in the mortgage financing world, when we see the word rate, we're referring to interest rate. So with an adjustable rate, it means your interest rate fluctuates throughout the term. You come into this knowing when your interest rate is going to change and whether or not it's going to go up or down. It's all part of your plan with the borrower. So you know when those adjustments will be made. But with the ARM, the interest rate fluctuates throughout the loan. Questions on this one? Cece's on fire. Jen and Shay on. Jenny's on the board. Shauna's on the board. Cece's got our highest answer streak, her little fire sign here. Question number 4, true or false? Interest rate charges and fees for VA and FHA loans are determined by the government. Ooh. Let's talk about VA loans and FHA loans. Understand, you guys, the only thing the government does with a VA and an FHA loan, the FHA loan insures the lender in the event of the borrower's default. The VA loan guarantees the lender in the event of the borrower's default. That's the only thing the government is involved in. That's all they're doing, is providing a safety net for the lender in the event of the borrower's default. What they charge, their interest rates, their fees, all that is still determined by the lender. The lender sets those rates, the lender sets those fees. They do have parameters in which they can work. The lender or the government does usury laws, set a ceiling and say you can't go above it, but they don't determine it, they don't set it. So when we're talking about, again, mortgage loans, financing with our with the government, they are there to protect the lender in the event of the borrower's default. And that's what the FHA and the VA loans are about, that safety net. Questions on this one? This was a good one. So it wouldn't have changed. So let's see. Comeback time. True or false? Per the Truth in Lending Act, the following in an advertisement would be considered a trigger term. The ad says HOA dues are $132 per month. Five seconds. HOA dues, $132 per month, a trigger term? No, because remember, it's specific numbers about the loan. So it's financing, down payment, interest rate. When we're talking about listing price, HOA dues, any seller contributions, seller concessions, those numbers are not about the loan. So when we see these test questions about trigger terms, we're going to see numbers, but we need to make sure that it's a number about the loan and not another number such as HOA dues. Questions on this one? See what we got. Jen's up, Shauna's up, Cece's on the board still, Shay and Jenny. These next few could get, do you guys have a competitive nature to you? That's part of the fun of Kahoot. Yeah, I hear you. All right, let's see. True or false? Mortgage loans are originated mostly from the primary mortgage market. And that is true. We talked about the players in the lending market. So we have the feds, which is the top tier. They're the ones that control the money that flows in and out of the economy. They also lend money to the primary mortgage market. The primary mortgage market is where you and I go when we want a loan, when we want to originate a loan. So if we're going to wherever, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Fairway Mortgage, Movement Mortgage, whatever, we're talking to a player on the primary mortgage market. Once that loan is originated, it may be sold to a player on the secondary mortgage market. So the players in the financing market, the feds, the top tiers, the primary is where we originate. Secondary is who purchases the loans from the primary. Questions on this one? We've got Jen, Cece's back up, Shay's back up, Shauna's still on, Mel's on the board. Welcome to the board. Number 7, true or false? A deed of trust is used to secure a mortgage loan. Yeah, yep. And that's all it's doing. It offers security for the lender in the event of the borrower's default. The deed of trust is what we record to protect the lender's interest. Connor tells us that we need to record that to protect the lender's best interest. And the deed of trust is the document that the lender uses to secure that loan. Questions on this one? Jen's staying on top and on fire this round. Cece's on, Shauna's up, Shay's on, Jenny's up. Jen's making a comeback with 3 in a row. Good morning. And then the last one, a short sale refers to the amount of time it takes lien holders to approve the sale. Nothing to do with the amount of time. A short sale is just telling us that the owner, the borrower, is short on funds. They are underwater. They cannot sell their home for what it's worth. So when we're talking about a short sale, we're saying the borrower is short on funds. Amount of time, it should be called a long sale, because they say on average we can expect 6 months for these things to get approval from the lien holders. So don't let that word short trick you. Questions on this one? See this final reveal from my podium. My third place is winning a Shauna this round. Good job. I got Cece as my second place. And then our first place is Ben. Good job, guys. And I got, who I got? Shay and Lynn. Lynn popped up. I got Shay and Lynn up with fourth and fifth runners. Good Kahoot. Good warm up. It's all good. Questions? So we are in the throes of Unit 21, and we are really close to talking about, I'm going to say the bigger section of Unit 21 where we go over our closing disclosure. Before we do that, though, I got a few more things to say about RESPA. So we're going to pick back up on page 577. And as a reminder, RESPA stands for the Real Type RESPA is an acronym for the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act. And when you guys see RESPA, what I really, really want you to see is the word settlement. Because RESPA tells the consumer the cost to close, the cost to settle. The other piece of RESPA, or TRID, I should say, the other piece of TRID then is TILA, the Truth in Lending Act. When you guys see TILA, the word we're really focusing on, can't talk and type at the same time. The word we're really focusing on is the lending piece. So TILA tells the consumer the cost to obtain the loan. How much is it going to cost me to originate this loan? RESPA tells the consumer the cost to settle. The two were integrated and now today are known as TRID. So a few more things. We talked about TILA with the advertising guidelines, those trigger terms. I think it was 14 or 15. It's one of our financing units, 14 or 15. And we've kind of mentioned RESPA, danced around it. But there are a few things that RESPA does that we just need to make sure that we're aware of. So on page 577, ways that RESPA protects the consumer. And one way they protect the consumer is by controlling business arrangements. This idea of a one-stop shop is gaining in popularity. So what do I mean by that? You may be able to find a real estate agent, a mortgage lender, and a closing attorney all under the same roof. They're all sharing the same space. They're sharing rent. They're working together to make this deal happen. Remember, you guys, I can never tell my buyers and sellers what attorney to use or what lender to use. I make recommendations. I make suggestions. I give them 2 or 3 and let them shop around. Even if I'm sharing an office with an attorney or a lender, I still can't make them use that attorney or lender. Everybody good with me? They'll be on that list, but I can't require you to use. If the buyer does use this attorney or lender that I share an office space with, then they need to agree. They need to be informed of our relationship. I may get some kind of kickback because I recommended them. Not a kickback, but I may get some kind of business arrangement, business relationship. Again, we're sharing rent. You may see sometimes in ads for sale for real estate, you may see something like, X amount in closing costs if using preferred vendors. That X amount in closing costs would be that controlled business arrangement. So if you use this lender and this attorney, then you may get X amount in closing costs. All RESPA says with these controlled business arrangements is that we need to disclose. We need to inform the consumer about the relationship, that we have a relationship. Borrower credit for yield spread premium. So we already said the yield is the lender's rate of return. Once upon a time ago, before TRID, some lenders would charge for that higher yield. They would charge the borrower an amount for that higher yield, just call it a fee, slap it onto their invoice, and the lender would get the higher yield and the borrower didn't get anything. TRID came about and stepped in and said, no, if you're going to charge for this higher yield, you need to credit the buyer. They don't need to pay for you having a higher yield, for having a higher rate of return. So if there is going to be a yield spread premium, RESPA requires the lender to credit that back to the borrower. Escrow account restrictions. We're going to talk about escrow accounts in just a bit when we look at our closing disclosure. One thing the lender will do for a borrower is they create an escrow account, and then as you send in your payment each month, remember our PITI, principal and interest, taxes, and insurance. A 1/12 of your taxes and a 1/12 of your insurance is sent in each month as part of your payment, and that goes into an escrow account for you, and it sits there until those bills come due. Well, RESPA put restrictions on how much lenders can charge. You may have just heard me say a 1/12 of annual taxes and a 1/12 of annual insurance. The 1/12 of the current bill is all the lender can charge, and that's thanks to RESPA's escrow account restrictions. If taxes and insurance go up next year, your mortgage payment will go up. They'll recalculate that 1/12. So it's always a current 1/12. Another escrow account restriction is the one we're getting ready to talk about with our closing disclosure. And that restriction, the lender's going to charge some to set up and originate the account. So how much they charge to set that up is restricted as well. So more on that. Loan servicing disclosure. Who's going to service the loan? Is it going to be in-house, or is the lender going to sell it? RESPA requires disclosure. Remember, if you're disclosing, all you're doing is telling. So when you originate the loan, the borrower has the right to know if the loan is going to stay in-house or if it can be sold to another lender. If the loan is sold to another lender, the lender that sold it needs to notify the borrower, and the lender that purchased it needs to notify the buyer. So it's all about disclosing what's happening to the loan. And then kickbacks and referral fees. This is the one that hit us personally. Life used to be good before TRID. I could recommend my buyer to a home inspector, and the home inspector could thank me with a $25 Target gift card. I could recommend my buyer to a lender, and the lender could thank me by taking me to lunch or giving me something, kickback and referral fee. Guess what? RESPA says no more. We can no longer give or receive kickbacks and referral fees for recommending services. So if I recommend this home inspector, the only thing the home inspector can do is say, thank you. If I recommend this lender, the only thing they can do is say, Julie, I appreciate you. Thank you very much. I look forward to working with your next buyer. Let's talk this through for a second. RESPA is a consumer protection. If I'm getting a kickback or referral fee every time I recommend my buyer use these services, am I recommending the services because they're good? Or am I recommending the services because I want my kickback and referral fee? Some of them are really good, y'all. We're getting to see an amazing example in just a second. So RESPA said, look, that's not fair to the consumer. I'm not recommending the best service. I'm recommending the service is best for me. So they did away with it. They said no more. Give or receive, which means somebody may offer you something, in which case you can't take it. And this is to or from settlement service providers. And a settlement service provider is anybody that offers a service throughout the settlement process. Brokers, lenders, inspectors, attorneys, remember all those gears, the surveyor, all those gears, all those people out going through the contract to closing process. We are all settlement service providers. We can't give or receive a dollar or a donut for recommending. Now, they like to come into the office, inspectors and lenders and attorneys. They like to come into the office and they like to bring us food. They like to bring us breakfast at our sales meeting or a box of donuts or something, you know. That's okay. They can still feed us as a whole. What they can't do is walk into the office with a box of donuts and say, you, and you get a donut because you sent me business last month. If you want a donut next month, you need to send me business. That makes sense? They can do something for all of us, but they can't target just one of us because we use their services. So let's look at some examples. Both real life. So the first one we've already said, home inspector agrees to pay a real estate broker $25 referral fee for each buyer the broker refers to the home inspector. Again, you can't do that anymore. Give or receive. All the home inspector can do is say, thank you. This is the one that hurt. Life was good. For each borrower referred by a real estate broker, a mortgage loan officer places a number drawing ticket into a box and gives the broker a stub. At a pre-designated point in time, a ticket is drawn and the broker with the winning ticket receives an all expenses paid cruise. Folks, let's be honest. Why am I sending my buyer to this lender? Because I want to go cruising. I don't care. I don't care if it's the best lender, good lender, doesn't matter to me. Interest rates don't matter to me. Why am I sending them to this lender? Because I want to go cruising. Do we see how this isn't in the best interest of the consumer? And that's why RESPA did away with it. So, gee, Julie, what's the big deal? It's only a ticket. It's only a $25 referral fee. What's it really matter? Bam. We could be looking at $10,000 per violation. How's that $25 target card looking now? You could get to go to the big house with the little windows for a year. An injunction is a legal stop. If they put an injunction on you, you are not working while they're investigating this matter. You may have to compensate any victims financially. And then if this thing goes to court, they could be looking at treble the damages. What does treble the damages mean? Yeah, you take those monetary damages and you times it by 3. Give or receive. Most of RESPA applies to the lender, but the kickback and referral fee thing applies to us specifically. Questions on RESPA? So the rest of our time together today, we're going to be looking at this closing disclosure, talking about the closing disclosure, talking about how we can, our responsibilities and how we can verify that our buyers and sellers are getting and receiving the right amount of monies from settlement. This was the last slide that we left each other with. And I think it's a good place to start with this conversation because it reminds us of the Real Estate Commission's roles when it comes to these closing disclosure. And the Real Estate Commission says that I'm going to be held responsible for the accuracy of the information on the closing disclosure that I should reasonably know. Please, like we said at the top of class, you guys, words matter. Am I responsible for all of the information on the closing disclosure? Am I responsible for all of it? You shake your head one way or another. I'm seeing yeses and nos. And the answer is no. I'm only responsible for the information that I should reasonably know. If I don't have access to it, I can't be responsible for it. So let's talk about this information. Stuff like the sales price, the amount of the due diligence fee, the amount of the earnest money deposit, seller pay closing costs. Is there a home warranty? Those are numbers that I should reasonably know because I can verify them from the sales contract. When this closing disclosure comes in for review, which I will talk about, when the closing disclosure comes in for review, first thing I'm going to do is pull out the contract. If we had any amendments to the contract, did we amend the sales price, for example? I'm going to make sure that the closing disclosure reflects all of the negotiable amounts between the buyer and the seller. Other information I should reasonably know. A lot of home inspectors, for example, will allow buyers to pay for the home inspection at closing. Now, they may offer a discount cash price if you can pay for it on the day of the home inspection. But the truth is, a lot of buyers, especially first-time home buyers, don't have that kind of extra money laying around. So the home inspector will work with them and they will allow them to pay for the home inspection at closing as part of their closing costs. If we're going to pay somebody or they're going to pay somebody at closing, that service provider will send me the invoice for me to pass it along to get on the closing disclosure. If I have received the invoice, then I should reasonably know that that is correct. I should be able to look at that invoice and look at the CD and say, yes, that is correct, because I have received it. Now, if I didn't get it, examples of numbers that I would not know, that I cannot verify. The conversations between the lender and the borrower, I'm generally not privy to. So when the lender says, I'm going to charge you a loan origination fee of this, and I'm going to charge you an application fee, and I'm going to charge you discount points, I'm not involved in that conversation. So I can't verify those numbers. Everybody with me? I can only verify what I should reasonably know. So again, test question alert. If it says that I'm responsible for verifying all of the information, shake your head yes or no. That's not your answer choice because that little word all means the whole disclosure from top to bottom. I'm only responsible for the information that I should know. Reviewing the closing disclosures is a big, big part of our duties and responsibilities for our clients. Why don't you guys set your chats to private real quick? I got a question for you. Remind me in a private chat, what is the A in old car? The A in old car. So the A in OCAR stands for accounting. And when I'm accounting, I'm helping my people, my clients account for their numbers, account for their funds. I have a duty to verify that what my buyer is bringing to closing is correct. I have a duty to verify that what my seller's gonna get is correct. Y'all, buyers and sellers don't know what these closing disclosures mean. That's why they have us to help them verify their numbers. And accounting to do with their money is a big part of OCAR. So, with all that being said, let's talk about the settlement statement used interchangeably as a closing disclosure. Bear with some of us old school people. But the settlement statement, also known as a closing disclosure. The first thing I've done for you guys is I've given you in your book the sources where you can find what we need to know to go through this discussion. So in Unit 21, we're looking starting at page 579. There's math concepts at the end of Unit 21. We're going to talk about prorating. Prorating is taking a shared expense and making it fair between the parties. And the biggest example, the biggest thing that is prorated between buyer and seller at closing is this year's property taxes. It's November 5th already. If you're buying my house today, is it fair for either one of us to pay the whole year's taxes? I mean, I'll have the share of the bill. I'll have most of the bill, right? But even most of it's mine, it's still not fair to make me pay the whole year, right? So how do we make it fair? We prorate it. So we skipped, when we were in Unit 23, or Unit 3, excuse me, we skipped talking about proration. We did talk about taxes. We talked about how to calculate annual taxes. Now back on page 62, we're getting into the proration piece of it. And then the math facts, section 5, back in the back of your book on page 857. I just got a question come in. I want to go back real quick. So the question is it willful misrepresentation or willful omission? I would vote omission because you didn't report it. You kept your mouth shut. Now, if you call and lie, that would be misrepresentation. But the fact that you did not report it could go down as willful omission. Good question. Thank you. So again, this is just our reference slide on where we can find the information that we're getting ready to go over. And let's talk about a few things before we pick up our calculators. So when we're dealing with these settlement statements, the good news is we're only dealing with debits and credits. And a debit is just seen as money that is owed, money that is due. It's money going out. A credit then is money you have coming in on your behalf. Buyers and sellers on their settlement statements, all of their numbers are either debits or credits. It's either money that they owe or money that they have coming in on their behalf. When we do this math in just a minute, we're going to figure out all of the buyer's debits. We're going to figure out all the buyer's credits. And the difference in the two is going to tell us how much our buyer has to bring to closing. So debit is just money that is owed. Credit is money coming in on your behalf. We're going to break down each party's respective debits and credits in just a bit. And let's start talking about proration. So again, a proration is just taking a shared expense and making it fair. Buyers have their own expenses. Sellers have their own expenses. Proration is a shared expense. This year's property taxes. would be prorated. If the property is in an HOA, HOA dues would be a shared expense. HOA dues, maybe they're monthly, maybe they're annually. The problem has to tell you. But either way, again, if our HOA dues are monthly and you're buying my house today, is it fair for either one of us to pay all of November's HOA dues? I'm only 5 days in, but it's still not fair for you to pay the whole amount. Another thing that we may see prorated at settlement is rent. If the buyer's buying with an existing tenant or a lease in place, when that property changes hands, so does the tenant. So we need to prorate, we need to share that rent. So when we talk about prorating, all we're saying is that we're taking a shared expense, making it fair between the parties. A true proration is a debit to one party and a credit to the other for the same amount. I'm going to say that again. A true proration is a debit to one party and a credit to the other for the same amount. In a sense, put real estate down for a second, put the closing disclosure down for a second. Somebody's giving somebody some money. Buyer's handing the seller some money, or the seller's handing the buyer some money. Now, bring real estate back into it. On closing day, buyers and sellers are not physically handing each other money. It's all getting hashed out on this closing disclosure. It's all getting hashed out. Both parties just have one bottom line once we calculate, once it gets it all hashed out. So we're going to have opportunities when we prorate to take annual amounts and make them monthly. If I have an annual tax and I need to break that down to monthly, what do I need to do? Yeah, see mouths move. Divide by 12. You have an annual amount, you have annual taxes, and you want to know how much they are each month. You take that annual amount, yep, you divide it by 12. We may also have an opportunity to take an annual amount and divide it by daily. Now, this is important. In pre-licensing world, remember you got real world and then you got pre-licensing world, right? In pre-licensing world and for your exams, we do not use a traditional calendar. In pre-licensing world, we use a 30-day month and a 360-day year. So in pre-licensing world, every single month has 30 days. 30 times 12 is 360. So how many days are in October in pre-licensing world? 30. We don't get Halloween in pre-licensing world, do we? How many days are in February in pre-licensing world? 30. Every month, that's it. Every month has 30 days. 30 times 12 is 360. So if we want to take our annual taxes and make them daily, we're going to divide by 360. With that being said, you may have practice problems that use the actual calendar. What I need you guys to always hear me say, just do what the problem tells you. Always do what the problem tells you. If it tells you to use a calendar year, but I'm certain for your exams, we'll be looking at a 30-day month, 360-day year. Just do what the problem tells you. Questions so far? So let's refresh just a little bit. Let's go back to Unit 3. And we're reminded about calculating finding for annual taxes, page 64. And we're reminded to find for annual taxes, we can use 64 or we can use our T-bar of our annual taxes. It's part of our assessed value. Rate or percent always goes in the bottom right. So page 64, whether you like formulas or T-bars, whichever. Those chats still set to private? Okay. So tell me in a private chat, what are the daily taxes of this property? And then we'll talk about it, look at it together. Give about another minute and then we'll talk about it. So what do we do first? Just read. Just read. A property is located in Davie County. It's subject to ad valorem tax rate of 0.80 cents per $100 of value. The property's assessed tax value is 172,500. We're told using the 360-day year. What are the daily property taxes owed on this home? So the first thing we're going to do, start down a T-bar. I know my T-bar, so I know what I'm solving for. I got to find annual taxes before I can find daily taxes, right? Because what's the formula tell me? The formula tells me how to solve for annual. So we got another step to do when we're done. I also know the assessed value of this property. It's 172,500. And then I have my tax rate is 0.80 per 100. What's that fancy word per tell me to do?
Divide.
Divide. So I'm going to take my 0.80 and divide it by 100. And I get a rate of 0.008. Up, down line in the T-bar means multiply. So I got 172,500 times 0.008, and I get annual taxes of $1,380. When you think you have an answer, please go back and look at the problem again and make sure that you have the answer that they are looking for. Honestly, I would not put it past them to have $1,380 as an answer choice. Did you get it right? Nope, because the question doesn't want annual taxes. They want daily. So now we got to take those annual taxes, take it a step further, divide by 360 to get daily taxes of $3.83 a day. So calculating daily taxes, calculating monthly expenses, monthly things. We got to be careful. We got to read these carefully because they will give you annual numbers. They will give you, that's cool. They will give you annual numbers, but the answer choice is looking for daily or monthly. You guys hearing me? So please, please, please read carefully. And especially when it comes to the math, once you think you have an answer, take 25 seconds and go back and read the question again. Guys, if you're going to miss it because you don't do it. Don't miss it because you don't take that extra step of dividing by 360. That's the most frustrating thing in the whole wide world. Questions on this one? Of course, my rhetorical question to you guys is always, if you didn't get it right, do you see why? Cool. That's what's important. That's what matters. Okay, let's take a break. And when we come back, we're going to keep going on this settlement statement. Welcome back. Guess a lot of you have your kids at home today. School's closed, I guess, for the election. Is that what's up? A lot of schools use as polling places. Gotcha. So the kids get a day off. It doesn't seem fair. No. They got Zoom now, don't they? No, I'm just kidding. All right, welcome back. Let me go ahead and take attendance. So we talked about taking annual numbers and making them either monthly or daily, and the importance of reading the question to know specifically what they're looking for. As mentioned, a proration is a shared expense between the seller and the buyer. So these are the things that we typically see prorated at settlement. This year's property taxes, make a note, this year's property taxes. If the seller never paid 2023 taxes, that's all on them, and it'll be due as part of their proceeds. They will get that before they get, thank you. And I have taken attendance, so make sure you tell me you're back. So this year's property taxes is a shared expense. HOA dues, again, maybe they're monthly, maybe they're quarterly, maybe they're annually. The problem has to tell you. And then rent. For our purposes, rent is due and payable on the first of the month. So it's whenever that property changes hands. One day they're the tenant of the sellers. The next day they're the tenant of the buyer. Some verbiage that you may see, that you may come across on your closing disclosures that we need to be aware of. An accrued item is one that is unpaid at the time of settlement. If it's accrued, it is unpaid at the time of settlement. And then something that's prepaid has already been paid by the seller. Probably the number one question to ask yourselves when we're prorating is who owes who? Who owes who? If it's unpaid at the time of settlement, that means the buyer will be responsible for paying it later in the year or later in the month. So if it's unpaid, the buyer will be responsible for it, which means the seller owes the buyer some money. If it's prepaid, that means the seller's already taken care of it. That bill has been paid and cleared. So things that are prepaid before settlement, the buyer will owe the seller. Now, in just a minute, when we talk, we're not going to say owe. Parties don't owe each other. It's a debit to one party and a credit to the other. So we'll start switching up that verbiage a little bit. The other thing when we're prorating, and this is important, this is a problem topic. When we're prorating, the seller, we're going to consider the seller responsible for the day of settlement. So if we're going to closing today, you are buying my house today. I'm the seller. I am responsible for today's taxes. I am responsible for today's HOA dues. I will get to keep today's rent. The seller gets the day of settlement. And I always remember it this way. When our alarms went off this morning, who owned the property? I did, the seller. So when we woke up this morning, the deed was still in my name. It's my property, so I'm responsible. Fingers crossed, everything goes according to plan today. When we wake up tomorrow, Who's the owner? Now our buyer. Today they're the buyer. Tomorrow they are the owner. Always remember though, you guys, with this being said, if the problem tells you to do something differently, always do what the problem says. Y'all love to argue with a problem. Y'all good at it too. Doesn't get you anywhere. Just do what the problem says. Do what the problem tells you. There are other expenses. The seller has their expenses or debits. The buyer has their debits. Each party's responsible for their own day. But when we're prorating that shared expense, we consider the seller responsible for the day of settlement, that shared expense. More verbiage. The problem may tell you to the day of closing. If they tell you that that proration is to the day of closing, what's that telling you is that the day is on the buyer. If it says through the day of closing, that's telling you that that is on the seller. Again, just do what the problem tells you. Talking about our days. If you see verbiage like a calendar day, actual days, then they're telling you to use the actual number of days, assuming we're not in a leap year. So I just have this here as a reference. You have it in your notes. I don't think you guys need to worry about memorizing the days of the month. But if you see a practice problem that tells you calendar day, 365 day, whatever, then we want to use the actual days of the month. What I think we see the majority of the time in pre-licensing world is this 360-day year, 30-day month, where every single month is 30 days. 30 times 12 is 360. And again, just do what the problem tells you to do. Questions? Okay, so let's pick up our calculators, or kind of. Let's get closer to the calculators for proration. So we got several different scenarios that we need to be aware of. If something is unpaid, it's accrued. Accrued means it's not paid by the time we get to settlement. That means the buyer will be responsible for it later in the year, later in the month, whatever. The burning question with proration is who owes who. So if the buyer's going to pay it later in the year, that means the seller owes the buyer for their portion. And on the settlement statement, it's going to shake out as a debit to the seller, credit to the buyer. It's money that the seller owes. It's money that the buyer has coming in. I want you guys to write something down for me on your notebooks. Everybody ready? September 1st. No, that's not my birthday. Why is that day important? September 1st. Why is that day important? There it is. Hold your place in the book. Yeah. What I hear?
Is stuff due?
That's when it's due. That's it. So hold your place in the book. Go back with me to page 65. And on 65, we have our taxation timetable. And our taxation timetable shows us that September 1st is when the taxes are due and payable. Closings before September 1st. Taxes have not been paid. September 1st is important. If we're going to closing before September 1st, let's say we're going to closing on March 15th, the problem may not tell you if taxes have been paid or not, but we know that they haven't in March. There's no way they can be paid in March because they're not even due until September. So that September 1st date is very important when knowing what to do with the taxes. So the fact that these are unpaid prior to settlement still doesn't tell me when closing is. Unpaid will have to give you a date. But there's two different scenarios. There's two different things to consider. Unpaid prior to September 1st, unpaid after September 1st. What we're looking at right here, debit to the seller, credit to the buyer, is unpaid prior to September 1st. So closing is, what did we just say, March 15th? There's no possible way that the taxes have been paid because they're not even due yet. So closing's March 15th. The buyer will be responsible for them later in the year, which means at settlement, the seller owes the buyer. And in closing disclosure speak, we say debit the seller, credit the buyer. When I prorate, I like the image. I like the visual of what it is that I'm prorating. I highly recommend when you guys prorate, you draw it out. So I'm looking at annual taxes, which means I'm looking at this year using a 30-day month. Every month has 30 days. I think the example we just used, we're going to closing on March 15th. Closing is what separates my timeline. The timeline also allows me to see that the seller is responsible for the front part of the year. The buyer is responsible for the latter part of the year. If you draw it out, if you put this little timeline on your scratch paper before you ever touch a calculator, sometimes you can eliminate an answer choice before you even touch a calculator. Just looking at our picture, who has the bigger responsibility of taxes this year? Who's going to pay more in taxes? The buyer. Yeah. So if we have an answer choices where the seller's portion is more, then we know that that one's not right. If we can eliminate anything before we pick up a calculator. So drawing it out allows me to see a couple things. I can see my annual taxes. I can see my dividing line on March 15th, our day of settlement that I just made up. The seller's responsible for the front part of the year. The buyer's responsible for the latter part of the year. Since it's prior to September 1st, taxes are unpaid. What that means is that later in the year, the buyer will be responsible for them. Now, they're not going to pay them. The lender is going to escrow them. They're going to pay them on their behalf. That's why I'm careful when I say the buyer is responsible. And they will be responsible for the whole entire year. And so at settlement, we're going to do a debit the seller, credit the buyer. The seller is going to pay the buyer for their portion of the taxes. And what are the seller's portion of the taxes? The first of the year. And since I'm prorating, through the day of settlement. The seller is responsible, which means they get to pay today's taxes. So the seller's responsibility, and there's 30 days in January, 30 days in February, and there's 15 days in March before settlement. So I got 60, 15 is probably 75. The seller's responsibility for this year is 75 days. The seller owes the buyer for 75 days of taxes. Previous problem before break, we figured daily taxes was $3.83. So how much does the seller owe the buyer? We're going to take that $3.83, multiply it by 75, and we will have an entry on the closing disclosures. Debit the seller $287.25, credit the buyer $287.25. This is how the seller pays the buyer for their portion of the taxes. Debit the seller, credit the buyer. We first found daily taxes, multiplied that by the amount, and got our figure for the CD. Questions so far?
I have a quick question.
Please.
What if the timeline, what if it was like the date was Halloween?
It's coming up next.
Oh, okay.
Yep, yep. So the question on the table is, what if closing is after September 1st? What if closing is after September 1st? Unpaid, everybody with me? Unpaid, closing is after September 1st. In that case, we do not do a proration. We do something called a double debit. Double debit tells us how many parties are getting charged. Both of them. 2 debits, double debits. Again, using the timeline, because I'm a visual person. I like pictures. So I'm using my annual timeline since we're talking about taxes. And now we're going to go to closing. In pre-licensing world, Halloween is actually October 30th. So we'll go to closing on pre-licensing Halloween, since we don't have 31 days. Seller owns the front part of the year. Buyer owns the latter part of the year. Don't touch a calculator. Who has the bigger responsibility this year?
Seller.
Buyer. I'm sorry. Yes, I said buyer. I meant to say seller. Sorry. The seller, yes. The seller has the bigger responsibility because they own the property for longer. So what we do in a double debit is each party pays their fair share. So we're going to figure out the seller's responsibility, and then the buyer's responsibility starts the day after settlement. Seller's responsible for the day of closing. Buyer's responsibility starts the day after settlement. Each party gets a debit. So if you want to count the days, that's up to you. I think we're good on counting days. But we're going to see an entry. There's going to be a debit the seller, debit the buyer. Here's the deal. This is after September 1st. The tax bill is due and payable. Instead of prorating, instead of letting somebody else pay the taxes after September 1st, the attorney's going to collect the seller's portion. They're going to collect the buyer's portion, and then the attorney will pay the taxing authority. They will send in one check on behalf of the property. This is not a proration. A true proration is a debit to one party and a credit to the other for the same amount. The parties aren't paying each other. They are paying their respective property taxes. And the attorney will send one check in. Does the taxing authority care where the money comes from? No, they just want the money for the property for this year. So after September 1st, the attorney will collect from both, double debit. The attorney will collect from both and pay on their behalf. So unpaid, which one do you do? The question is, When is settlement? Before September 1st, debit the seller, credit the buyer. After September 1st, double the debit, double debit. And remember, always do what the problem tells you. Questions on accrued items. Prorating accrued.
Okay, quick question. So with double debit, we collecting 30, 30, 30, 30, 30, 30, 30, 930s.
Yep.
Okay.
Times our $3.83. Yep.
Okay.
So that was the seller's debit. And then we'll do 230s for the buyer.
Okay.
Times $3.83, and that'll be theirs. Yep.
Okay. Double debit. Double debit.
Our other proration scenario then is if these items have already been paid. So again, if we're talking about annual taxes, if it's prepaid, it's after September 1st. The bill has come out, the seller paid it, and then we went to settlement. The buyer owes the seller some money. And in the closing disclosure, that shakes out as a debit the buyer, credit the seller. The seller's already paid the whole tax bill. I'm the seller again. You're buying my house on November 5th. I want some money from you because I've already paid your taxes for the rest of this year. So I want to collect. And we do so, debit the buyer, credit the seller. Prepaid. Again, when you guys are prorating, when you're dealing with this, please just draw it out. No, what did I say, 11? And let's go to closing now. Let's go a little closer to Thanksgiving. Let's go on November 24th. Seller owns the front part of the year, buyer owns the latter part of the year. I know it's got to be after September because taxes have already been paid. Who has the bigger responsibility for the year? Who owes the most? The seller. Now we need to figure out the buyer's responsibility because they are the one that owes the seller. They are the one with the debit. The buyer's responsibility starts the day after settlement and goes to the end of the year. Seller's responsible for closing, for the day of closing. The buyer starts tomorrow. Today they're the buyer, tomorrow they are the owner. When you're counting forward on the timeline, it's really easy to get the number of days wrong. And I have a tried and true method of making sure that we count right. Y'all ready? Highly sophisticated. When you're counting forward on the timeline, count it out on your fingers. Use these digits because I need to count for November. I need to count November 25th, 26th, 27, 28, 29, and 30. How many days do we have left in November? If you look at that and said 5, you missed the whole dang question. Not because you don't know what you're doing, but you didn't count right. So take the error of counting out of your equation and count it out on your fingers. Everybody hear me? Common mistake is miscounting. So I got 6 days left in November, 30 days in December, which tells us the buyer owes the seller for 36 days of taxes. When you're going forward on the timeline for the rest of the month, count it out. You said taxes were $3.83. So in this case, the buyer would owe the seller $137.88. And again, we don't say owe. It shakes out as a debit the buyer, credit the seller. The buyer is paying the seller for their portion of the tax. In a sense, the buyer is reimbursing the seller in this case. Prorating. Draw out the timeline. May it be a year, may it be a month, whatever. You're prorating. Draw it out. Do your dividing line so you can see the seller's responsibility and the buyer's responsibility. And then stop and ask yourself, who owes who? Questions on prorating? So we'll see this. We're going to obviously do a practice problem together. So we'll see that in motion in a practice problem. Then of course I got plenty of practice for you guys as well. Turn with me, if you will, 587 and 588 in your book. 587 and 588. 587 and 588 helps us see specifically what are the debits to the seller, credits to the seller, debits to the buyer, credits to the buyer. When we're doing these closing disclosures, I always consider 587 and 588 like your formula. Because if we don't know what's a debit to whom or credit to whom, then we don't know what to do with the numbers. So it's kind of like the formula. If we don't know the formula, then we don't know what to do with the numbers. So we're going to go through now, and I'm going to break them down. We're going to talk specifically about seller and buyer, but I'm getting this information from 587 and 588. Maybe put it on flashcards. Maybe take a picture of these 2 pages with your phone so you can pull them up when you're sitting in the school pickup line or whatever. But somehow we need to know what's a debit to the buyer, credit to the buyer, debit to the seller, debit to the credit to the seller. And that can all be found on 587 and 588. So let's talk about the seller first. Seller's debits and credits. Their debits on page 588. The seller's debits, they are going to pay commission unless we're told otherwise. Always do what the problem tells us. The seller is responsible for paying the deed preparation fee. The seller pays the closing attorney to prepare their deed for closing. Seller is also responsible for excise tax. Excise tax back in Unit 5 took that purchase price, divided by 500, and then rounded up to the nearest whole dollar. Unit 5. CDE, that's how I remember, commission, deed prep, and excise tax. In addition to CDE, back on page 588, the seller's responsible for their own personal things. So for example, to pay off their existing loan, their personal property taxes, the recording fee to satisfy their outstanding mortgage when that gets paid, delinquent taxes, so if they never pay 2023, and then any IRS tax liens. So seller's debits are going to be their personal things plus CDE. The other seller debit is back on page 587 under the double entry items. A double entry item means that it's going to show up for both parties. We're going to see it on the seller's closing disclosure, and we're going to see it on the buyer's closing disclosure. On the seller's, the due diligence fee will be a debit. They already received that money. Remember when we went under contract? Back up to when the contract was formed. I had acceptance and I had communication of acceptance. Congratulations, we're under contract. The buyer gave the seller a check for the due diligence fee. Now that we fast forward back to closing, we need to reverse what we did. So it'll be a debit to the seller at settlement. Another double entry item is going to be the sales price. And for the seller, the sales price will be a credit. It is money they have coming in. You pay me the sales price, and in exchange, I give you my property. So the sales price will be a credit to the seller. I don't think we need to worry about any of those other double entry items, due diligence and sales price. Of course, we'll talk about buyers in just a second. Questions on the seller's debits or credits? Back to 588. Let's talk about the buyers. First off, buyers' debits. They got a lot more debits than the seller because they're the ones paying. So the sales price, that double debit or that double entry, double entry, it's going to be a debit to the buyer. The buyer is paying the seller the sales price. And in CD verbiage, we don't say the buyer's paying the seller. We say debit the buyer, credit the seller. Anything related to the buyer's due diligence will be a debit to them at settlement if it's unpaid. So for example, if the seller, or excuse me, if the buyer has not paid the home inspection, if they have not paid for the survey, the pest inspection, all those due diligence costs that the buyer has while they're doing their inspections and investigations, anything unpaid prior to settlement will be a debit to the buyer. It's money that they owe. All lenders' fees will be a debit to the buyer. Loan origination fee, discount points, something called interim interest that we're getting ready to talk about. All lenders' fees, this is monies that the buyer owes their lender. The buyer hires the attorney, so they get to pay the closing fee. The buyer gets to pay to have their brand new deed and the lender's deed of trust recorded. I want us to look at 588. I want to do a side-by-side comparison. On 588, under the seller, it says the seller pays the deed preparation fee. And then under the buyer, it says that the buyer pays the deed recording fee. I need us to see those differences. The seller pays to have the deed prepared. The buyer pays to have the deed recorded. Again, when we woke up this morning, it was still the seller's deed. So to get it ready for closing, the attorney will charge the seller. It's in the buyer's best interest to record their new deed. So they will pay that deed recording fees. Everybody see that difference? Prepared versus record. Make a note. The buyer will also pay for their title insurance. That policy will kick in when that deed records, when it's official, when it closes. But the buyer's going to go ahead and pay for the policy at settlement. It'll go into effect once they become the owner, once that deed changes hands. There are some items that are prepaid before settlement, also known as POC or paid outside of closing. This means that they've already been paid. The appraisal fee, the buyer's already paid this. The appraiser's not going to go out and do their thing until they've been paid. Also, the credit report fee. The lender's not going to pull the borrower's credit report without them paying. You will see these on these problems. These are called distractors. What's a distractor's job? To distract you. If they're POC, then we've already been paid. We're not going to calculate them for closing costs. We're not going to calculate them when we're answering the question, how much does your buyer have to bring to closing? Again, always do what the problem tells you. So buyer's debits, and then back to 588, their credit list is a lot shorter. The new loan, on the day of settlement, the lender is bringing the loan amount on behalf of the buyer. The buyer doesn't have that money. They're getting that from the lender. And so on the day of settlement, the lender is bringing that money in on behalf of the buyer, which means on the day of settlement, the loan is a credit. The buyer will spend the next 30 years paying the lender back. I always think of settlement, when we talk about settlement and settlement statement, it's kind of like a snapshot of what's going on today. And what's going on today is the lender is bringing the loan amount on the buyer's behalf so they can purchase the property. Our double entry items, if the due diligence fee is a debit to the buyer or the seller, debit to the seller, then we know that's going to be a credit to the buyer. Again, we're just reversing what we did when we went under contract. When we went under contract, the buyer handed the seller a check. Now that we've made it to settlement, we're going to reverse it. Debit the seller, credit the buyer. And then another credit for the buyer is going to be the earnest money deposit. The seller never touches the earnest money deposit. The earnest money's been hanging out in an escrow account the whole time that we've been under contract. So the seller has nothing to do with the earnest money deposit. It'll just show up as a credit to the buyer. Again, let's back up. Remember when we went under contract, you looked at your buyers and you said, congratulations, you're under contract. I now need 2 checks from you. I need a due diligence check made out to the seller, an earnest money check made out to the escrow agent. And if you get to closing, both of these will be credited back to you. We told our buyer we're going to credit it back to them, and now we're doing it. So assuming we make it to closing, due diligence and earnest money are credits to the buyer. Questions on 587 and 588. And if you do a couple of these for practice, which I got for you, don't worry. Questions? Another thing that we're going to calculate for the buyer is interim interest. Interim interest is something that the buyer owes their lender. Buyer owes interim interest to the lender. So interim interest will be a debit to the buyer. And all interim interest is, it's the buyer getting caught up on their interest. What do I mean? Let's look at another timeline. When did we go to closing on the previous problem? The 25th? Let's do that again now. So the previous problem, we went to closing on November 25th. Anytime you originate a new loan, first off, let me say, for our purposes, mortgage payments are due and payable on the 1st. Okay, 1st of the month, due and payable. Whenever you originate a new loan, the borrower does not have a mortgage payment the first. The borrower's first mortgage payment will be the second first. So if we go to closing on November 25th, you don't have a mortgage payment on the 1st, December 1st. If we go to closing on November 25th, your first mortgage payment is January 1st. Skip the first. Write that down. Skip the first. Mortgage payment is due the second first for the next 30 years or whatever. Why? Remember, interest is paid in arrears. What does that mean? What do you think of when you hear arrears? Where's your rear end? It is behind you. Your principal and interest is the same every single month. So if we charge you, if there was a mortgage payment on December 1st, interest is in arrears and it's the same for the month, which means we would be charging you interest for the entire month of November. Not really fair, is it? You didn't own the property until the 25th. Because interest is paid in arrears, because principal and interest is a full month, they can't charge you a mortgage payment. They can't have you pay a mortgage payment on December 1st. Your first one will be January 1st, and it'll cover December's interest. So what is interim interest? Interim interest is getting caught up. Doesn't the lender want to start collecting interest today? The day that they originate the loan, they're going to start collecting interest today through the end of the month. Interim interest is always calculated from the day of closing to the last day of that month. Never ever go into the next month. The lender will collect interest for December 1st when they make that payment on January 1st. And putting our lender hat back on, our 14 and 15 lender hat, through the eyes of the lender, I brought you money today to buy a house. When do I want to start collecting interest? Today. So the buyer, in this example, the buyer owes the lender for 6 days of interest. That'll get them caught up. No payment on December 1st. First mortgage payment on January 1st, and that's when they pay December's interest. February 1st, they'll pay January's interest. March 1st, they'll pay February's interest. Interest is in arrears. Questions so far before we look at the next step? So the next step is figuring out how much. And a throwback from when we amortize. Remember when we did those 3 steps? When we amortize each month, we figured how much was applied to principal and how much was applied to interest. And one of those steps that we saw was the balance times the interest rate. That gives us annual interest. When we were amortizing, we then divided by 12 to get monthly. Now that I'm in interim interest, I need to divide by 360 to get daily interest. So for interim interest, we take the balance times the interest rate to give us annual interest, that piece we've seen before when we amortized. Balance times the interest rate equals annual interest. Now divide by 360 to get daily. Once we have that daily, we times it by the number of days. I'm just using the same example we've been using. Those are property taxes, though. That's not fair. Let's use a different example. I don't know. I'm making numbers up. Okay. So if we calculated daily interest and we got interest of $62.38 a day, multiply that by 6, and we will see a debit to the buyer on the settlement statement for interim interest. I made numbers up of $374.28. We found daily, multiplied it by the number of days, and that allows us to see what the buyer owes the lender to get caught up on interest, interim interest. And we will see this again in our practice problem. Questions on interim interest so far? Just easing you in.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So this reads balance times interest rate and annual rate, or they saying it's like
That's equals annual interest. Balance times the interest rate equals
okay.
annual interest. Divide by 360 to get daily interest. Skip the first. Interim interest is the day of closing to the last day just of that month. The questions? Can I erase the pink? We good? Okay. Let's take a break. We're just trucking right along. And that started right when the bell did. Lynn, send me an email. I won't remember. I'm telling you right now. That's a long way away, you know. Welcome back. So I am taking attendance. We have just a few more things to say before we dive into one of these closing disclosure problems. And to say the last few things I need to say, I got to go off book. So we're referring to what we see in the syllabus. Remember, that's what we're tested on. So let's go off book, NIB. And let's wrap this up and talk about what all this stuff with the closing disclosure means for us. Let's bring this home. So first off, the commission, I think we get this, expects us to have a thorough understanding of these settlement statements and the closing disclosures. Why? OLCAR. This is how we OLCAR right here, is to make sure our people's numbers are accurate. And in order to ensure that, we need an understanding of these settlement statements and how they work. So we start today. Verifying the accuracy of entries, again, about which we should reasonably know. Y'all be very careful with that word all. And as you're reviewing these settlement statements prior to settlement, there's a really good chance you're going to find mistakes. Humans prepare these things. So if you find a mistake, if you have a red flag that goes up anywhere, then we need to reach out and ask questions, have conversations, make sure, do what we need to do to make sure that our buyers or sellers' bottom lines are accurate. That's the OLCAR piece of it. So always looking for those red flags, even up until the settlement table. Again, what can we verify? What am I responsible for? Well, I know what's a debit and a credit. I got this information right here. And again, as you start doing these, it just kind of becomes commonplace. I can also verify the numbers from the sales contract. So sales price, due diligence fee, earnest money deposit, seller pay closing costs. I can pull out my contract and look at the settlement statement and make sure that those numbers align. If there were any amendments, that those amended prices, amended amounts come out on the settlement statement. We're working on learning how to prorate. We can verify prorated items, interim interest, excise tax, and we can just straight line add. So we can just add and subtract and make sure those bottom line figures, even if I can't verify the numbers, all of the numbers, I can straight line add. So we can, those bottom line figures. And then any unpaid invoices that we have knowledge of. Again, should the home inspector allow the buyer to pay for the home inspection at settlement, they're going to send me the invoice. So I send it on to make sure it gets on the closing disclosure, to make sure that the home inspector gets paid at settlement. So if I've received any of these invoices, I can verify that they're on there. I can verify that they're accurate. Also for us, what happens if we don't review these settlement statements? What happens if we don't look at these things? Well, as we said earlier, I think this kind of bookends this conversation nicely. Failure to review them, failure to report any errors or missing entries could result in disciplinary action by the real estate commission. Why? Because you've harmed their public. Their bottom line, their money wasn't accurate. And so, thank you. That's why we have a duty. We have a duty to make sure that these bottom line numbers for our buyers and sellers is correct. So with all this being said, we are not doing a full-blown settlement statement in this class. You guys don't have to worry about a full-blown settlement statement until you get to post licensing. You come see me or whomever in post licensing, and you will be doing, go back with me 2 pages, 567 and 568. 567 and 568. And this is a sample also of what you'll see in the real world. Now, I will say this, in the real world, we're going to have two closing disclosures, one for the buyer and one for the seller. So you're not going to see everybody's numbers on the same. But other than that, in the real world, this is a sample closing disclosure. Everything on 567 are debits. So there's buyer debits, there's seller debits to various people. There's your loan costs, there's your prepaid, such as interim interest, there's your escrow, there's your real estate agent's commission, right? Debits to third parties is all on 567. And then if we flip over to 568, coming down to those summaries of transactions, buyers on the left and sellers on the right. So when we look at the buyers on the left, box K is in Kelly, is all of their debits. L is in Larry, is all of their credits. Debits minus credits. I have my buyer owing $14,147.26. You guys seeing that? That bottom line figure down there. And then sellers on the right. M is in Mary are all their credits. N is in Nancy are all their debits. Credits minus debits tells us that your seller is getting $64,414.96. So when we talk about these bottom line figures, it's just that. The bottom of 567, the bottom of 568. We will do a full-blown one of these things when you come see me in post licensing. The good news is you don't have to worry about all of this yet. We're just easing you in. What you're going to see for my exam and your state exam is referred to as a mini closing disclosure, in which you're going to be asked, how much does your buyer have to bring to closing? So we have to look at all the buyer's debits. We have to look at all the buyer's credits. And as we're going to see, debits minus credits tell us how much your buyer has to bring to closing. So before we get in this mini CD, I'm going to go off PowerPoint. I'm probably going to be off the rest of the class because it's going to take us better part of it to go through it. So if you guys don't mind, so I don't forget, let me go ahead and just finish out Unit 21. So we have this done. So again, you got your key terms at the beginning of Unit 21. Lots on the closing disclosure, lots on TRID in this unit. We talked about some TRID laws before we left each other. We also went through the entire contract to closing process in Unit 21 as well before we left each other. Key point review is at the end of the unit on 589. And then your student quiz on 591. And it has some practice for you for these mini CDs. So as we're talking about practice, you can know there's some at the end of your book. There's some in the online learning system. When we're done, we'll show you where you can find everything. Also, as a reminder, you guys have already seen this, but this is just your reference page. This is where in the book you can find all this information that we're talking about. You can find how to do these closing disclosures. And then you got those 50 problems in the back of the book. Starting on page 865, there's a lot of numbers here because there's lots of good practice back there on prorating. There may even be an interim interest problem thrown in back there, I'm sure. Probably some mini CDs. So there's lots of good practice from this unit, the math that we're getting ready to do at the back of your book as well. So I need to stop sharing just for 1 second, which means everybody's looking at everybody. And let me just say a few things while I'm setting myself up here for our closing disclosure problem. First off, I'm going to be very, very honest with you guys. This closing disclosure problem that we're getting ready to work, it's a lot of work for only one problem. You only get 1 point for the whole problem, and it's a lot of work. I put it out there. I know you guys. I used to teach in person, and you guys would go out in the hall in person, and you would say to each other, this is a whole lot of work. I'm not doing it. I'll figure it out when I get my license. And to that case, I say, well, there's nothing I can do about that. I think you should at least try. I think you should at least start to get this because, OCAR, and these are duties that we owe our buyers and sellers, making sure these are right. If you're just throwing your hands up now before you ever try, then I can tell you what kind of outcome you're going to have. So it is a lot of work. I put it out there. It's a lot of work for how many problems? Just one. When you're taking these tests, always do the math last. Save the math for last. Make sure you have everything else answered before you start the math. Of the math, do this mini CD last. Because this is the one of the whole entire exam that'll take you the longest. And it's only how many points? Just one. I can't have you guys running out of time with unanswered questions because you're focusing on this CD. Does everybody hear me? Or this mini CD? So when you come to a math question, seriously, when you're taking the test and you see all 4 answer choices are numbers, don't even read it, just bookmark it and come back to it. Always save the math for last. Of the math, do the mini CD last. It's of my opinion, you guys, that of all the math, this is the most important math that we do. So again, we're just easing you in with these mini CDs. Post-licensing in the real world will expose you to the full-blown closing disclosure. Questions so far before we're getting closer and closer. So I'm in the online learning system, and we're going to go up to Unit 21. And in Unit 21, we got several closing disclosures. We're getting ready to work mini number 1 in class, but you can see you have the answer key here. So we have everything worked out that we're getting ready to do. Plus, remember, we're recording. So you can always go back and do these at your own speed, on your own time, and verify it with the recording. There's other practice. There's mini CD2, there's mini CD4, mini CD5. Like we said, there's some mini CDs in your book. There's going to be some in your Unit 21 quiz in the online learning system. These have the answer keys, and it'll show you how it worked it out. It'll show you how it got to where it did. So you may want to start with these, comparing your work with the answer key. But I think we're getting ready to do one together in class together. I think if you guys do 1 or 2 on your own, 3 on your own, you're okay. So I don't need you spending all of your study time on this, because remember, there's only, I don't remember if there's 7 or 10 math questions, but there's only 2 handfuls of questions, right? The math alone can't fail you. By the way, where's mini CD number 3, you might be asking yourselves? CD3, in my opinion, is a lot harder than what you're going to see on your exam. Once you do 1, 2, 4, and 5, if you're up for the challenge, let me know, and I'll be happy to send it to you. But otherwise, just stick with 1, 2, 4, and 5. I think 3 is complicated. Very, very complex. And I don't think you'll see that. I know you won't see that hard on your test. So when we do these problems, we can see here, I have the information for your exams, for your practice. It's either going to be one big run-on paragraph, or it's going to be like this, broken up, little bullet points, you know, kind of broken up. But anyway, you're going to have all the information right here. And all of this, like we said, it's a lot of work for one question. And the bottom line that you're going to be asked on your exam is, how much does the buyer have to bring to settlement? So we're going to be calculating my focus. The only person I care about when I'm doing this problem is the buyer. So when they give me a seller debit, and they will, because they like to do that, that seller debit is your distractor, right? And this is why we need to know 587 and 588. So we know the things that are the debits to the buyer, debits to the seller, credits to both parties as well. So you have scratch paper on your test for your exam, both tests, mine and your state exam. We'll talk about that as we get closer. So my scratch paper's on my right, and we can see I got the problem that we just looked at over here. And this is where I got to get very, very creative to make it all fit on one screen. Let's see, let's do that. Here. And the first thing I want you to do when you see these problems on your scratch paper, I want you to take your scratch paper, and at the top, I want you to write buyer, because that's all we care about. And then I want you to draw a line down the middle. And on one side of the line, we have the buyer's credits. And on the other side of the line, we have the buyer's debits. And what we're going to do is, referencing pages 587 and 588, we're going to go through the problem, and we're going to identify what's a credit to the buyer and what's a debit to the buyer. And in the end, we'll have everything separated. We'll know what's a credit, what's a debit. Debits minus credits tells us how much our buyer has to bring to closing. When you do these problems, always start at the top and work your way down in order. Do not skip around. If you skip around, you will skip something, I promise. So start at the top and work your way down to the bottom. I know I always preach about reading. I'm not going to stand here and read all this to you. We already know what this question is asking me. We'll go through it line by line. But bottom line, keep in mind, what we care about is, how much does your buyer have to bring to closing? Do I have any questions before we get started? So from the beginning, the buyer enters into a purchase contract with the sellers to buy the seller's house for $210,750. AI keeps getting in my way, y'all. Okay, so I got a purchase price of $210,750 through the buyer, and I can see your mouths move. Through the buyer, is that purchase price a debit or a credit? Is it money they're getting, or is it money that they owe? Purchase price. Oh, I'm seeing O, which in CD verbiage shakes out to a debit. It's money that they owe. So we're going to take that purchase price, debit the buyer $210. I'm sorry, $210,000, 750, Another suggestion I have, once you start filling these in, is to label the numbers, sales price, purchase price, whatever. In the event you ever need to go back, if it's labeled, it's a lot easier to find out where you are, what it is. So I do suggest, you don't have to, but I do suggest labeling as we go. The purchase contract provides for a November 24th settlement. I like to write that somewhere at the top of my paper where I know I can reference it because I know I'm going to need that date several times. So it could save me some precious test time if I know where that date is easily. The sellers pay taxes prior to closing. It will be prorated at settlement using the 360-day method. And we're told taxes are $2,610. So right out the gate, I saw the word prorate. And I'm going to take a minute so I can process, so I can understand what I just read. And that's where I like the timeline. That's where I like the visual. So I'm dealing with annual taxes. We're told closing is the 24th. That's my dividing line. Seller owns the front part of the year. Buyer owns the latter part of the year. Seller has a bigger responsibility because seller owned it more this year. Because closing is after September 1st, we need to take that extra step to make sure we're clear. Have taxes been paid or have taxes not been paid? And in this case, the seller has already paid the taxes. So what I'm telling you is that the seller has paid the tax bill for the whole year. And so now my question to you is, who owes who? Anybody want to venture a guess? Who owes who? And if you're chatting, you can abbreviate. I know B is buyer and S is seller. Don't say BS. B is buyer. S is seller. I caught you in mid typing there, didn't I? So I'm getting it in the chat. Who owes who? And what I'm seeing, I'm liking. The buyer owes the seller. Everybody see that? The seller's paid the bill the whole year. Put yourself in the seller's shoes. You don't own the property for the whole year, but you paid the bill for the whole year. Doesn't somebody owe you some money? And the only person you can collect from is the buyer. In CD verbiage, buyer owes the seller shakes out as a debit the buyer, credit the seller. The buyer owes the seller. So we're looking at debit the buyer, credit the seller. Now we got to figure out how much. The buyer's responsibility starts the day after settlement because we're prorating. So they have, no, we've already done this, but it's good practice. How many days left in November? We're dealing with November 25th, 26, 27, 28, 29, and 30. I can't stress this enough. Please don't look at that and see 5. You've missed the whole dang question because of a day. Does everybody hear me? So we got counted it out carefully. We have 6 days left in November. I got 30 days in December. So I heard it. Thank you. I didn't hear who it was, but thank you. I got 36 days. This is how many days this year the buyer owns the property. It's their responsibility. Problem tells me taxes are $2,610. Why don't you guys take a minute, take $2,610. First find daily. Once you find daily, multiply that by 36. And then tell me in a private chat what that number is. Find daily taxes and then multiply by 36. And I'd like to hear from everybody. About another minute. So we have our annual taxes of 2610. I need to break that annual down to daily. How do I do that? All we need to do here is divide by 360 pre-licensing world. And I get daily taxes of $7.25. What I'm telling you is every single day, this property owes taxes of $7.25. That's how much daily taxes are this year. We've already determined that the buyer will own the property for 36 days this year. Times that by daily taxes. And we have a debit to the buyer of $261 for prorated taxes. Debit the buyer, $261. That is the buyer reimbursing the seller. What questions do I have? Prorating. Draw it out and then stop. Take a second and ask yourself, who owes who? Questions? May I erase the proration math? I'll keep the debit credit, of course. Thumbs up, head bobs. Everybody good? Now, the problem with this is I got to do it like one thing at a time. So bear with me here. Then we're told debits and credits for the following items should be made to common practice. What is common practice? Pages 587 and 588. That's our formula that tells us what's a debit to whom and a credit to whom. So those pages, once again, are our common practice. They're important. So I got an earnest money deposit of $4,500. For the buyer, how's that going to shake out? And I can see your mouse move. For the buyer, what is the earnest money deposit? It is a credit. They paid that once, and we told them when you close, this will be credited back to you. Let me do it this way. This will be credited back to you at settlement. So we're crediting the buyer the earnest money deposit, $4,500. Financing, I have a new loan of $175,000. On the day of settlement, how does the loan show up for the buyer? And again, I can see mouse move. The loan amount on the day of settlement is a, can they buy the house without it? So on the day of settlement, the loan amount will be a credit. So the lender is bringing this money on behalf of the buyer so they can buy the house today. The buyer will spend the next however long, 30 years, 15 years, whatever, paying the lender back. I'm not going to lie. The loan amount is the one that most often gets skipped. It gets overlooked. Your buyer can't buy without a loan unless they're a cash buyer. So please, please, please make sure you remember to get the loan amount as a credit to the buyer. Questions on that?
I have a quick question. Is the conventional loan 30-year, is all this a distractor, or we need to be looking at that?
Hold on, we're going there next. Right now, we're just on the, because that's what you guys do. You read the whole thing, figure out what you need to do, and you overskip. You skip over, overskip. You skip over the loan amount. So I need to pause here for a second to make sure everybody has that. Head bobs from all? Perfect, perfect. Now that we have the loan amount, there's a conventional 30-year mortgage loan. Y'all, that's a distraction. I don't need that. That doesn't shake up as a debit or credit to the buyer. However, I got an interest rate of 7.5%. Hang on to that. We'll come back to it in just a second. We also have a 1% loan origination fee and 2 discount points to be paid by the borrower. All lender fees are of the loan amount. I'm going to say that again. All lender fees are of the loan amount. What does the lender care about? They care about their money. And their money is the loan amount. So all lender fees are of the loan amount. I have a 1% loan origination fee. So I take my loan amount times 1%, and I get a loan origination fee of $1,750. 1% of the loan amount. I also have discount points that are of the loan amount. Discount points. The number of discount points in the problem tells you the percentage of the loan. So if they're charging 2 discount points, all we need to do is calculate 2%. So I got my loan origination fees. I got my discount points. These are lender fees, which is money that the borrower owes. So we will have a debit to the buyer for the loan origination fee. We will also have a debit to the buyer for the loan discount points. Question: how I got these numbers, why I put them under debit, anything. May I erase the loan origination fee and discount point math? I'll keep the debits and credits, of course. It'd be good if I erase that. Then we have, moving right along, we have interim interest through November 30th on the borrower's new mortgage. I think this problem is very kind because it tells us how to calculate interim interest, but we still need to be aware. So it's telling us that we want to calculate through November 30th. So we're looking at November 24th. If we're going to closing on November 24th, when is the borrower's first mortgage payment? Is it December 1st? I got adamant no's. I think we're all good here. Is it January 1st?
January 1st.
There it is. Yep. Thank you. So all we're going to do with interim interest is get that borrower caught up. The loan was originated today, and the lender wants to make sure they collect interest. Let me move over here. The lender wants to make sure that they collect interest for the rest of that month. Interim interest is always the day of closing to the last day of that month. How many days does the buyer owe for interim interest? They owe for November 24th, 25th, 26th, 27, 28, 29, and 30.
36.
Look at that and see 6? It's wrong. Now I heard somebody say 36. You went too far. Remember, interim interest is the day of closing to the last day of that month. When the buyer makes their first mortgage payment, no payment on the first mortgage payment will be due on January 1st. And that mortgage payment on January 1st will pay December's interest. Interest is paid in arrears. Questions on how I got the number of days? Now we got to figure out how much. And I need to go back to the problem for 2 pieces of information. I need the balance. On the day of settlement, the balance is the loan amount. So we have a loan of $175,000 times my interest rate is 7.5%. So I have annual interest of $13,125. Balance times the interest rate gives me annual interest. I'm going to take my annual interest and divide by 360 to get daily. balance times the interest rate gives me annual interest. Divide by 360 to get daily. I know the lender needs to collect 7 days. So we have the buyer owing the lender for interim interest, $255.22. This is their interim interest. The lender is now satisfied. They have been paid interest up until December 1st. They are caught up. Questions on interim interest, how I got the 255.22? May I erase the interim interest math? How we doing so far? All we're doing is going through and we're saying this is a credit, it goes on the left, or this is a debit, it goes on the right. We're just going through the problem and identifying the buyer's debits and credits. Again, how the heck do we know this? Pages 587 and 588. Private mortgage insurance, or PMI. PMI is what the lender charges on a conventional loan when the loan to value ratio is 80% or more. So I have a conventional loan. We're going to be charged PMI. This tells me, this particular problem tells me that PMI, where'd it go, is due the first year due at closing, and it is 0.40% of the loan amount. What's the word of tell me to do in a word problem?
Multiply.
Yes, multiply. So I got the loan amount times point. Don't forget that point. It's very important. 40%. I'm getting PMI, debit the buyer, $700. Another lender charge is money that they owe their lender. This particular lender is collecting PMI for the first year up front. Some may take that amount, divide it by 12, and tack it on the payment. All lenders are different. Always do what the problem tells you. I have my borrower's homeowner's insurance annual premium, $444, to be paid at closing. Insurance, any kind of insurance, homeowner's insurance, most insurance, I'll say homeowner's insurance, renter's insurance, automobile insurance. When you pay insurance, medical insurance, when you make the payment today, it covers you for the period in the future. So in order for the buyer to have homeowner's insurance for the first year, they'll have to pay in full at settlement for that first year. Now, once they start making their payment on January 1st, the lender will have a 12th of this year's insurance. And so when insurance comes due a year from now, the lender has escrowed that money and they can pay it on behalf of the buyer. But today's settlement, today, the buyer has to pay for that first year because there's nothing in escrow yet. So we want to make sure they're covered for the first year. Due diligence fee is also a credit to the buyer. Again, we told our buyers when we went under contract, the due diligence and the earnest money will be credited back to you at settlement. So now we're here and we're honoring that. I got an attorney's fee. I can see Mal's move. Who pays the attorney's fee? Buyer. Buyer hires the attorney. So that's going to shake out as a debit to the buyer. Oops. Oh my, what did we just do here? What's that? $450 attorney's fees. Title insurance premium. The buyer will pay for the title insurance policy at settlement. It kicks in once that new deed is recorded. Once the buyer becomes the owner, title insurance is an owner's policy. Once the buyer becomes the owner, it kicks in, but the buyer's got to pay for it at closing. So title insurance is a debit to the buyer for $475. By the way, title insurance is the only one that I know of that you don't have to renew. Title insurance is a one and done. The buyer's covered for as long as they own the property. Deed preparation fee of $65. Why don't you guys tell me in a chat, private chat, what we're going to do with the deed preparation fee? And I'd like to hear from everybody. So if you don't know, say IDK. Deed preparation fee. 587, 588. Specifically, 588. Ah. Ah. Tricky, tricky. Let's all look at page 588. Let's see this again. This is tricky, I know, which is why I'm glad we're here. So we can sort this thing out. 588. Deed preparation fee is a debit to who?
Seller.
It's a debit to the seller. So what do I do with it on the buyer CD?
Don't do nothing. Distraction.
Absolutely nothing. I've looked at these before. I don't remember which one, but one of these answer choices is $65 off. Banking on you doing something with the deed preparation fee. Does everybody hear me? They put these things in here. These are called distractions. They're going to put commission in. They're going to put deed prep. They're going to put excise tax. This is why we need to know. These are seller figures, and we're calculating how much the buyer has to bring. These are your distractions, guys. Do I have questions on that? I'm not doing anything with it because I'm not calculating for the seller. Do I have questions? Awesome. Thank you. Okay. We need to pause, take a break. We'll finish this up. I got a lot more to say. Trust me, we'll get through it and then we'll talk about what all this means. Unfortunately, with the break, I can't erase what I have, or else I'll have to come back and redo it. I'm not trying to take our time like that. So we're just going to have to see the clock through the through the math. Is everybody good? Can you guys see? I think you can still see it okay. If not, set your phone for 10 minutes. But we'll come back in 10 and finish this thing up, talk about what it means. Welcome back. So I'm going to take attendance. Let's jump back in this. Okay, deed preparation, distraction, because all we're caring about is what the seller or what the buyer has to bring. Deed preparation is a seller debit. Now, I got a deed recording fee. Is the buyer going to pay for that?
Yes.
Yes. Because whose best interest, Shauna, is it to get this new deed recorded?
The
buyer.
The buyer, yes.
Buyer, yes. So we're going to debit the buyer $15 deed recording fee. They're paying to have their brand new deed recorded. I got a $300 survey fee. Survey is part of the buyer's due diligence process. So the buyer will pay the survey. I got a $25 courier fee. There's almost always some kind, and I have taken attendance, so please make sure you tell me you're back. There's always some kind of courier fee or wire transfer fee or some kind of nickel and dime you fee. So I got a courier fee. This is a charge to the buyer for $25. Questions before we look at this last piece? Anything we've done so far? Again, we're just going through what's a credit, what's a debit. And I know this because I know the formulas on pages 587, 588. CC, did that fix it?
The formulas for five. Yeah, and that's it.
CC, is that, are you in? Does that fix it? Cool. All right, so this last piece, this is these loan escrows, and this is what we were kind of talking about earlier today when we're talking about RESPA and what RESPA does to protect the consumer. And one thing we said RESPA does to protect the consumer is they put escrow account restrictions. Those escrow account restrictions are referring to the lender's escrow account that they have for the buyer. So there's two pieces of this. The first one is our PITI payment. So you make that mortgage payment every month, you send that payment in every month. That payment includes a 12th of this year's taxes and a 12th of this year's insurance. That 12th every month goes into an escrow account for the borrower. They have their own. When those bills come due each year, the lender can take that money from the borrower's escrow account and pay them on their behalf. So that's the first piece of it. RESPA says you can't collect more than a 12th each year. The other piece of it is what happens on the day of settlement. And this is where we are. The lender has to collect some money at settlement to fund the escrow account. They got to originate it, set it up, and fund it. But they also want to collect a little bit to have a cushion. Remember, RESPA says you can only charge a 12th of the current taxes and a 12th of the current insurance. Is there a really good chance taxes and insurance could go up next year? They could be more than what they were this year, right? If the lender doesn't have money, spare money, we'll say in the escrow account, then they can't pay those bills on your behalf. So what they do is they collect a couple months. The problem will have to tell you how many. And they collect some months from the borrower, from the buyer at closing, so they can fund that account and then have a cushion. So when those bills go up next year, They can still pay on your behalf. They readjust your PITI, and now they're charging you a 12th of the next year's taxes and insurance. The problem has to tell you how much the lender wants to collect. Now, this is a lender charge, so these will be debits to the buyer. And if we look, I got loan escrows, I got 4 months of real property taxes, and I got 2 months of homeowners insurance. I have to go back up into the problem a little bit. I got to find the current annual tax bill and the current homeowners insurance. So homeowners insurance is 444. The current tax bill is 2610. What I want you guys to do, private chat, I want you to take the annual tax bill, divide it by 12 to get monthly, and then multiply it by the number of months that the problem tells us. And once we do that, we're going to go through that same little exercise with homeowners insurance. We take the annual, divide it by 12 to get monthly, and then multiply it by the number of months that the lender wants to collect. So in a private chat, tell me how much is 4 months of taxes and how much is 2 months of homeowners insurance. And keep them separate. I'm sorry. I need an amount for taxes and a separate amount for insurance. We got another minute and then we'll talk about it. So I have annual taxes of $2,610. I need to take that annual tax, divide by 12 to get monthly. So that gives me monthly taxes of $217.15. The problem tells me they want 4 months. So we're going to collect $870 for escrow, for taxes. And then same thing with insurance. I have annual of $444. Divide by 12 to get monthly. Each month, insurance is $37. The problem tells me they want 2 months. So we are 74. These are lender charges. So both will be a debit to the buyer. This is escrow tax, and this is escrow insurance. Can you guys see the whole way to the bottom? Can you see the 74? I usually run out of room, so I'm actually doing really good this time. Questions on those escrows? The 870. 870 is 4 months of taxes. The 74 is 2 months of insurance.
Oh, 2 months of, that's right, 4 months tax and 2 months, okay.
Yep. Let me say something else about this escrow, because I know in the past we've gotten very upset about this. The lender's not taking the borrower's money. The lender's using it to pay their bills on their behalf. When you sell your property or when you pay this loan off, if there's anything left in escrow, you'll get it back. They're not taking it, they're using it to pay your bills. Everybody good with that? We paid off a condo a couple of years ago. Did it on December 31st. What a great way to bring in the new year, right? Middle of January, I walked out to my mailbox and there was a check from the lender. Oh, sweet. You know what it was? It was the money that I had left in escrow. So they're not taking it, they're using it. And what they don't use up, you'll get back. So now, where are we? Let's see. Let me get some of this out of our way. We have been through the whole problem, top to bottom. And all we did, I know it sounds so simple, but seriously, all we did was went through and identified what is a credit to the buyer
Oh, yeah,
and
then we
what is
gotta
a debit to the buyer.
add all the debits and subtract the credits. And
Shauna,
then,
is that, I think you're on mute. Do you mean to be? Do you have a question? No?
I'm sorry, I was talking loud.
I just didn't want to interrupt you, but I didn't want to not answer you either. I figured that was an internal conversation, but if it wasn't, I just wanted to be sure. All right. Now what I want you guys to do is just add up all of the buyer's debits, add up all of the buyer's credits, and then pause. We'll figure out what to do from there. Just add up all the debits, add up all the credits, and then we'll go on to the next step. Yep. She's got it. Off by about $10. Let's see what we got here. Y'all compare mine with what you got. For the buyer's debits, we have sales price, 210,750. I got a prorated taxes, our loan origination fee and discount points. We calculated interim interest. There's our first year's PMI insurance, our first year's homeowner's insurance. Got an attorney's fee, title insurance, deed recording fee, survey, courier, and then our escrows, escrow taxes, escrow insurance. And when we add all this up, we get about 219,869.22, give or take a few cents. If you didn't get exactly what I did, it's somewhere with rounding. When you round, and most problems will tell you, when you round, go out at least 3 decimal places until you get to the end. That'll give you the most accurate. And then we tally up all the credits. I got our earnest money deposit, our loan amount, and our due diligence fee. We add up all of the buyer's credits, 179,750. Debits minus credits tell us how much our buyer has to bring to closing. So in a private chat, everybody tell me A, B, C, or D. Yay. Everybody in? Debits minus credits, selling agents. I need you to reach out to your buyer and tell them that we go to settlement. They're going to have to bring a cashier's check or a wire transfer for $40,119.22. Everybody about rounding, and this is important. As long as you're not getting carried away with rounding. What do I mean by that? Go out at least 3 decimal places. You're not gonna miss by rounding alone. If you're going out 3 decimal places, you may be a few cents off, but you'll be able to look at your calculation and say, this one is close enough. It's only a couple pennies off. So don't stress out about rounding. Okay. Yep. I mean, I got 22 as well, but I can look at that. The answer choices aren't going to be pennies away. Like I said, y'all pull your calculator up. I can't tell you which one, but I know for a fact one of these is $65 off. It's not by rounding, it's because that's the seller's debit, right? If you don't calculate your days right, one of these might be off by that daily amount. So it's not by rounding, it's the calculations. Buyers coming to closing, you're telling them how much to bring. They can't bring a personal check. It's got to be readily available funds. So we're looking at either a cashier's check or a wire transfer. Which one? Ultimately, probably just depends on the attorney. They may have their preference. The lender sends the borrower their closing disclosure. Who can remind me how many days prior to settlement does the lender have to send? You can show me. How many days prior to settlement does the lender have to send the borrower their CD? That was like early 21 stuff before we left each other. You got it. Don't question yourself. It's 3. So 3 days prior to settlement, 3. Again, early 21 stuff before we left each other. It's a TRID thing. TRID requires the lender to send the borrower their CD 3 days prior to settlement. That gives the borrower time to review it, see if they have questions, da 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 da. The lender then sends the closing disclosure, or the information, I should say, to the attorney. The attorney and the lender put finishing touches on everything, finalize everything. And then the attorney sends you and I the closing disclosure to review it. So selling agents, you'll get that CD from the attorney. Listing agents, it'll also come from the attorney. The seller has nothing to do with the lender. So the closing attorney is preparing the seller CD as well. But you and I don't get it until close to the end. They got to finish their thing. Lenders are actually telling buyers now, and I love it. The last closing I had, the lender sent the buyer an email, and it was like, I don't know, it was like font 72, and it was red and it was yellow highlighted and bold. And it said, do not go to the bank until you've talked to your broker. Because I'm the one that's got to verify it. I'm the one that's got to make sure that it's right. I'm the one that gets to tell my buyer how much they have to bring to closing once we've reviewed it, once we've checked it out. So how do we do overall? What questions do we have? It's a process, you guys. This is what I know. If you don't touch this again until our exam, you might as well just put down B and move on, or C or D or whatever your favorite is. Give yourself a 25% chance of getting it right. If you do touch it, you might get it right. It took us, what, an hour and a half to go through it together? But it's also the first time you guys met it. It's the first time you guys saw it. When you do a second one, it'll go a little faster. A third one will go a little faster. The more of these you do, the easier it gets. And once again, going to reference us back to pages 587 and 588. Because that's how we know how to do these. If you don't know 87 and 88, it's your formula. Comments, questions?
Miss Julie, when we do like our first, say we pass the test, we go out, we're a realtor next month, we get a sale, will our BIC help us the first couple times just to, okay, good.
I sure as heck hope so, Lynn. And if not, you may want to find a new BIC. Especially you guys as provisional brokers, sitting with, and not your BIC, maybe a seasoned agent if they say, you know, hey, here's somebody that's been in the business for 15 years, go sit with them. You know, your first few times, somebody should be reviewing it with you, making sure that it's, you know, but you know, like we're saying, once you do a few, um, again, they do a full-blown CD and post licensing, but there's so many times in post licensing that you guys have already had a closing or two before you do the post licensing class to do this. So yes, refer to your BIC, refer to your firm, and they will absolutely assist you. And again, you guys, we got to review these things. I mean, I know how this sounds. I'm not going to lie to you guys though. It's not a matter of if you find a mistake, it's a matter of when you find a mistake. Mistakes happen. And I don't know why, but they seem to happen a lot in closing disclosure. Y'all, we reviewed a CD for our buyers a month or so ago. I don't know how it happened, but they charged them for the home warranty, not once, not twice, but 3 times. There were 3 charges for the home warranty. What if I hadn't found that? It'd have been like $800-900 extra dollars out of my buyer's pocket for nothing. Y'all got $800-900 extra dollars laying around, especially when you're buying a house. You know what I'm saying? So this is that big old car thing. The other thing about reviewing the CDs, listing agents. Remember, the seller typically pays commission. Listing agents, you need to make sure the commission's right. I know we're going to verify the commission, by golly. Let's treat our commission like all those other numbers on the closing disclosure, right? They're all just important. Selling agents, you may not be privy to the seller CD. Remember, they keep them separate. If you're not privy to the seller CD, if you cannot see how much commission is on the closing disclosure, then you need to either reach out to the paralegal or the listing agent to verify your commission. I did one several years ago. I was the listing agent. A gentleman named Mike was the selling agent. I got my seller CD. I reviewed it, and guess what? Wasn't there. It's not that it was wrong. It just wasn't there. That was our commission. And I called the paralegal and I said, yeah, Mike and I want to get paid. Y'all know what she said? Oopsie. Oopsie doesn't really pay the bills, does it? I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't caught that. My seller was the sweetest lady you'll ever meet. So I like to think after settlement, we said, oh no, it's not on there. Sit down and write us out a check. And she'd have been like, okay. I'd like to think that. If she's not, then the firm may need to take legal action to collect. Please review these things. You have to review these things. And it takes time. It's a process, you guys. And you just went through step 1. So don't, y'all love to beat yourselves up. You just met this like 2 hours ago. Go easy on yourself. Questions? In addition to the mini CD, you very well may also see a standalone proration problem and a standalone interim interest. So doing those calculations could get you a couple math problems. I want to, I'm not going to do it today because I know our brains are a little mushy after all this. When we come back together on Thursday, I want to take just a few minutes. All we talked about today was prorating taxes. So when we come back first thing on Thursday, I want to spend just a few minutes and show us what prorating homeowners insurance could look like, and also what prorating rent looks like. So we'll go through those on Thursday. It'd be a nice little review, a nice little refresher on taxes or prorating, excuse me. So we'll do that on Thursday. Can I erase all that? Does everybody have it? All right, let me stop sharing just for 1 second. So I kind of regroup here real quick. I'm not going to get far into Unit 17 today, but I do want to just introduce it to us, and we'll get out of here a few minutes early. But I do want to go ahead and introduce it to us. So once we do a little bit more with prorating on Thursday, yeah, that was right. Once we do a little bit more prorating on Thursday, then we'll pick back up here. So what I'm trying really hard to find. Up next, we are heading into Unit 17. And Unit 17 is our appraisers unit. That's it, Shauna. You got it. So 17, again, these are one of these units, kind of a random unit. When you signed up for this class, you probably didn't think that you were going to be putting on an appraiser's hat. But guess what we're doing in Unit 17? We got to think like an appraiser. We're going to put on that appraiser's hat. Now, we're going to talk about broker things in this unit as well. So we're going to talk about, we've mentioned our comparative market analysis or our CMAs. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But the big focus, the big point of Unit 17 is real property valuation. And this what allows us to know kind of how the appraiser works. Again, stay in your lane, but having an understanding of the process is helpful, especially when you're working with buyers. They tend to have a lot of questions about the appraisal. The appraisal is going to be required by the lender. The appraisal is actually property. It belongs to the lender. The lender requires the appraisal to determine the loan to value ratio. Loan to value ratio. And through the eyes of the lender, the word value to them is sales price or appraised amount, whichever one is less. The lender knows what the buyer and seller are contractually obligated. We have a contract. We have a purchase contract with an agreed upon purchase price. But the lender wants to make sure that they're not lending money on something that it's not worth. So in order to have an idea of what the property's worth, the lender requires this appraisal, and then they're going to originate the loan based on the sales price or the appraised amount, whichever one is less. So the appraisal is a property, the lender, they let the buyer pay for it though. Isn't that nice? It's settlement. If it's a cash buyer, the appraisal is not required. If it's a cash buyer, the buyer's welcome to get an appraisal, but it's not required. So to kind of just get us started, we're going to talk about the word value in this unit. We're going to talk about what that means to me and you. And then we're going to talk about the appraisals process. So the appraisal process with our appraiser's hat on, and kind of a very basic understanding of what the appraiser does to arrive at their opinion of value. Now, the appraiser, there's 3 different approaches to determining value that the appraiser may use. So we're going to talk about each of those approaches and how they may use those and when. And then we're going to pick up our calculators again on Thursday, and we're going to do some math to calculate the approaches to value, the 3 different approaches to value. So I do want to say this, because this kind of gets our gears working a little bit. The first thing we're doing in this unit is defining what an appraisal is. And this is straight from your book, page 456. Copy and paste. An appraisal is defined as an estimate or opinion of value completed by a licensed appraiser of a specific property as of a specific date. So let's break this down just a little bit. An appraisal is an estimate or opinion. Check that out. An appraisal is just one person's opinion. Does that mean a different appraiser could have a different opinion? Yeah. Sometimes these things get contested because it is one person's opinion. Whether or not it can be contested may be up to the lender. But all it is somebody's estimate. It's somebody's opinion. Appraisers are licensed, which means they have to take a class and pass a test. And they have a licensing board kind of similar to us. And they have to do CE each year to keep their license up, do different things, pay fees. The appraisal is of a specific property. The appraiser's job is to find value for 123 Main Street. What the house across the street appraised for doesn't matter. We're looking for the value of 123 Main Street. And the appraisal is only good for a specific date. When we look at the 3 approaches to value, one of the approaches, the appraiser is studying closed comps. And as properties in the neighborhood close and time goes on, comps adjust. The appraisal is only good for 1 day. Most lenders will let us use it for 6 months, but it's only good for 1 day because as comps change, the value changes. This word value in this discussion is huge. Only the appraiser gets to use the word value. You and I are not determining value. We're going to learn on Thursday, we're determining something called probable sales price. We'll see that on Thursday. I like to introduce you to this word value, though, because this is a little word that could get us in trouble. If you run around with buyers and sellers and start talking about the value of the home, you are acting like a licensed appraiser. Only appraisers get to use the word value. And I need you to be remember what we said at the top of class, start a class, words matter. And it's very important. So you're sitting at this listing appointment, a seller looks at you and says, what's my home worth? What can you sell it for? How we respond matters. I cannot say the value of your home is X amount. What I'm saying is, I believe your probable sales price. So that's one of the big differences between appraiser and agent, broker, is the verbiage that we can use. But more on that on Thursday. Again, you just want to get the definition out, start getting that word value in your head, because it's really important that we not say it. Do yourselves a favor and take that word value out of your vocabulary. Just get it out, and then you don't have to worry about it. Fair enough? All right. I think this is a good place for today. Again, when we come together on Thursday, we'll do a little bit more proration. Then we're going to pick up here on 17. We'll get through 17 on Thursday. Up next is unit 11. So after 17, we'll get started on 11. 11 is our landlord-tenant unit. So we're going to define that relationship. What questions do we have? That's it. Y'all have a good day. Y'all please be safe out there today. People are crazy. Y'all know this, right? Everybody be safe out there today. And I will see all of you first thing Thursday morning. Thank you.